Welcome to Your Career Unscripted. I'm your host, Jane Bernhard. I will be interviewing business leaders and recent graduates on the different perspectives, strategies, challenges, and advice on building meaningful careers across different generations. There's no right way to build your career or live your life. And I'm so excited that this show is in collaboration with Texas Immersive Institute at the University of Texas. We hope to help you define success on your terms and not anyone else's. Our guest today is Seth Shapiro. Seth is a two-time Emmy Award winner and a global leader in media and technology. His clients and partners have included Comcast, Disney, Goldman Sachs, IBM, and Intel, among many others, and a range of new ventures. A trained equity options trader, he was an early advocate of blockchain in media and has been active in the space since 2016. He's a senior advisor to the Shiba Inu Foundation and a partner at Alpha Transform Holdings. He was previously head of business development at Alphabet Fund, head of strategy at VideoCoin, CEO of Alpha Networks with IBM in 2018, and founder of Artaku. Mr. Shapiro was previously an adjunct professor at USC and a governor of the Television Academy, the home of the Emmys. He's a chair of the Web3 Advisory Council at the National Association of Broadcasters. His book, Television Volume 1, is an Amazon bestseller and covers the evolution of radio and television, 1890 to 1980. In the public sphere, Mr. Shapiro has served as an expert before both the Department of Justice and the Federal Communications Commission. As head of production at DirecTV Advanced Services, he launched over 25 services, including TiVo by DirecTV, the world's first major DVR platform. Prior to joining DirecTV, he was a senior producer of games at the Walt Disney Company. He has been quoted in The Economist, The New York Times, The LA Times, Variety, and The Hollywood Reporter, among many others. Mr. Shapiro is a magna cum laude graduate of New York University and was a Delbert Alumni Scholar at Case Western Reserve University. Hi, Seth. I am so excited to have you on the podcast today. You have had truly a remarkable career in media, technology, and business. I find your trajectory very inspiring. You've worked with some of the biggest companies in the world. You've founded companies. You're an advisor to companies. You have 2 Emmys. You've written an Amazon best-selling book. Your bio is crazy. We all have many lessons to learn from you. And so thank you so much for being on the show.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Jane. Thank you.
So to kick things off, as I mentioned, your career is so interesting and you've done so many different things. Can you walk us through the different phases of your career and how you navigated moves and decisions along the way?
So I began as a music guy. When I was growing up in the 70s and 80s, music was kind of where it's at in terms of media. TV was still not that great. Movies weren't the thing that really spoke to kids my age. That was kind of an older gen thing. So you looked at musicians, either the guys that had already happened, like the big British bands, or the people that were happening now, whether it was punk, new wave, or eventually, in my case, hip hop. But I was a jazz arranger. I was originally a rock guitarist, but also a jazz guitarist. So I got really into harmony, harmonic analysis. I went to a school to do a double degree in music composition and psychology. I was there for 2 years. Then I transferred back to NYU. And just like one of the things that hopefully happens in your life if you're lucky, I got to NYU in the dorm where Rick Rubin and Russell Simmons had built Def Jam recordings just a few years before. So all those guys were still around. I went to the signing party between CBS and Def Jam, which was the largest pressing and distribution deal up till that time. And it was extraordinary to be in New York then, watching this new form of music sort of take off and the rest of the world going, what the hell is that? That's not music. But we kind of knew better. And, I was a trained musician. So people would be like, why are you doing that? And because this is it. This is the real vital form. And Rick said something once that I always think about, which is that he said, we grew up not that far from each other. And he said, I went to a half white, half black high school. And the white kids were listening to records from 15 years ago. And the black kids were listening to records from last week. And that was really true about hip hop. It was this sort of thing that at the time you couldn't really put your finger on. It was evolving constantly. So that was super fun. I wound up starting a label after that and then gradually doing more video as well, and became convinced that digital was going to, the way it was with hip hop, right? Digital was completely remaking what the music business and music as an art form were. And there were a lot of people who hated that and said that using digital tools was not music. And I always thought that was really stupid for a number of reasons, but that happens every time there's a major shift. After a while, I started to think, if it's doing it to this, it's going to do the same thing to TV and movies. It's just a matter of time. And those were already much bigger businesses. So I thought, maybe I'm going to do that. So I started really learning how to code. And I moved to LA, left the music business, which my girlfriend at the time thought I was insane. And I started over, got to LA as one of the few guys who could actually produce, but could also code. And I was basically never out of work again. The first major job I had was for the original acquirers of Blizzard when World of Warcraft came out. I started producing educational software. And then I went to Disney and managed a line of digital products there, games, kids' games. But weirdly, again, I had been really lucky out of NYU and had been called in for a job at something called Interactive Television. It was a startup that Time Warner was involved in at the time. And this woman who was like a headhunter just said, I don't know what this thing is, but you came in last week and you seemed really smart. I'm thinking you might be the right guy for this. And I was like, interactive TV, what's that? But anyway, I wound up working there for a while. And that kind of convinced me also. That's probably sort of where I started to say, well, digital is going to completely change TV and movies too. So I had done that and had thought, I'm going to do games because games are where it's at. There's work here. It's super interesting. But eventually I want to go back and be in the ground floor of the digitization of the TV business. So while I was at Disney, DirecTV, I'll never forget this. There was an ad in something called The Red Herring, which was the big tech magazine at the time. And I was staying at the Parker Meridian in New York on a job for Disney in Manhattan. And I'm looking through this magazine and it said, new startup allows people to pause live TV. I'll never forget. I went, somebody put a hard drive with guide data inside a set-top box. That's it. This is how it's going to start. It was just obvious to me. So I was like, this is it. I'm doing this. So that company was called TiVo. TiVo wound up doing a deal with DirecTV. DirecTV wound up placing a tiny ad in the back of the Hollywood Reporter. I think I emailed them 30 seconds after that thing hit the street. And I said, you don't know me, but I'm at Disney and I know exactly what you're talking about. I'm the guy you're looking for. And I think they called me like 5 minutes later. I went from Disney to DirecTV the next day, interviewed with 7 people. On the way out of the parking lot, they offered me a job. I stayed at Disney to finish everything I'd been doing. Started DirecTV around 6 months later. And I did wind up being a big part of the TiVo launch team. And I wound up doing all sorts of digital products for the NFL. It's probably the best known stuff, the TiVo launch. And then interactive apps for CBS, NBC, ABC, Fox, HBO, Showtime, Stars, MLB, NFL, more or less everybody over the next, whatever it was, 6 or 7 years. So that was great. While I was at DirecTV, that's when the beginning of online video happened. It's when Google acquired YouTube and the networks were really, all of whom I knew by now, right? We're trying to figure out what to make from this. So I got approached by some venture people to evaluate various deals. And I thought, you know what, this is what I'm going to do next. I want to be doing strategy rather than production and design, which is basic service design, which is what I've been doing. So I left, and then I wound up getting recruited out by Comcast, who were the number one distributed TV. DirecTV was number 2. Did a bunch of stuff for them, which was great. I had a liquidity event at the end of that, and my ex-wife said to me, why don't you take some time off? What have you always wanted to do? And the 2 things I'd always wanted to do were open an office in Amsterdam and start doing consulting work in Europe on all the things that I'd been doing in the US, because at that point we were really ahead. And I wanted to understand how the markets really work, because everything I did was always at the effect of the markets, downstream from the financial decisions. And I didn't really understand how the markets worked. So I did open an office in Amsterdam, which was sort of my most profitable thing for, 5 years. I had lots and lots of Dutch clients, Benelux clients, people in Europe. But I hired a guy from the CBOE, the Chicago Board of Options Exchange, and I learned how to be a delta neutral market maker, which is like the best way to learn how the markets really work. So at that point, before it was kind of fashionable, I became an options trader and was doing that in the background for a long time. When Bitcoin happened, I saw sort of one of the original big figures in that, the guy who created the first stable coin, an old friend of mine at a wedding. And I said, can you teach me how this stuff works? This was like 15. So I said, yeah, come over to the house. So I got really early exposure to blockchain and thought, in addition to just thinking it was a really interesting investment thesis, especially after 2008, that the tech would be really, really valuable to the media and entertainment business if I could get them to kind of get their heads around it. So from that point on, I had one foot in the financial world and one foot still in media. I did a lot of work on various streaming services, but over time, I got more and more involved in the venture side, the fund side, started a couple companies, to your point, that were media companies with blockchain involved. One was with IBM. One was kind of a broader play on what became known as the NFT thing. I guess that's sort of where I am now. I still have one foot in each world. And in the meantime, I've done three things. I'd become a governor at the Emmys, at the Television Academy. So I was very active in getting things like AR, VR, and XR added to Emmy contention, which was great to be the governor and help make that happen. I taught at USC, School of Cinematic Arts in Marshall for 10 years, a program on basically all of this, how digital is rewriting the M&E business. And I wrote a book on the history of TV, which was really interesting, but also the most time-consuming thing I've ever done. So those are the broad things.
Thank you for walking us through that. You have such a dynamic and varied career. What really sticks out to me is how you embraced and tried to almost get ahead of disruption. On the topic of disruption in general, it sounds to me like you've really embraced change, even just at the beginning of your career, talking about taking a risk and pivoting out of music. Were you always someone that embraced change? And what advice do you have for people who see an industry that they want to go into but don't know how to pivot into something? Because you learned to code, you learned the film and television industry, all of those different things. You were willing to take on new opportunities. What in you was able to do that? And what advice do you have for people who want to cultivate the skill of embracing change?
That's a really good question, Jane. I mean, in my case, I think it came out of feeling when I was in my teens and 20s like I was really late to the party. Everything interesting had already happened. The media business that was really powerful when I was a kid, it was full. I was not going to get a job at a major label. If I did, it would pay almost nothing. I'd be paying dues forever. It was a dead end. And similarly, every other area of the media business was full. There were way more people who wanted to work in it than there were jobs. And so kind of out of necessity, I thought, well, where's there room? And the place that there's usually room is the thing that hasn't happened yet. And that's also an opportunity if you're really interested. So it's hard because you are gambling. You're taking a risk that this thesis that you have, whatever it's going to be, that video is going to be delivered by the internet or whatever it is, you're taking a bet with your career that you're going to be right. But ultimately, what I learned, Jane, is the worst case that happens is you spend some time on something and it doesn't pan out and you feel like maybe you wasted your time. And then 5 years out of nowhere, all that information becomes incredibly valuable and it leads you to an opportunity you never would have had it otherwise. So for me, it worked out. And I think it works out for most people, but probably it all came out of the fact that when I started, I didn't feel like there were any opportunities unless I skated ahead to where the puck was going.
And is that why you also really invested in creating your own opportunities? If you felt like they weren't there, if you couldn't see them, because you've clearly found gaps in the market and then been very intentional and strategic about filling those gaps. Is that entrepreneurial mindset something that was natural to you? How did you cultivate the skills of being entrepreneurial, whether it's on the investment side or even just founding a company and coming up with different projects? And also, what advice do you have for people who maybe do see a gap in the market and don't know how to go about filling that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think in my case, it was all about falling down the well, landing hard, getting up, figuring out how to climb out of the well. What did I learn from falling down the well? What's the next opportunity, and do it again? And then hopefully one of them starts to pay off. So there were a lot of things that were kind of dead ends. But I think when you're young, that's okay. You're learning. If you go to law school, by contrast, which I almost did, you are putting your energy into a system that's largely fully baked. And the upside is fairly known, right? So from a trading perspective, the max loss and the max profit are pretty well known. If you're going to be an attorney, do you want to become a partner? Do you not want to become a partner? Do you want to go into private practice? If you want to do pro bono work, all those things are fairly known. The market is very clear. If you're going to go into something that hasn't been done yet, there's no real prediction engine. There's no augur to tell you what the odds are. You just kind of have to feel it out. But the more you do it, the easier it gets. And I guess the part of it that makes it sort of more palatable is you look at the people who've become really innovative, the people who've really built stuff out of scratch. They all went down that road and they all had horrific mistakes and they all almost went out of business or went out of business. So there's no shame in it. When I was at USC, I worked with this innovation lab and they had that thing on the wall that's famous now, move fast and break things. I think that's a good thing to do when you're in the first half of your 20s or the middle of your 20s. Like, you have time and you don't really know where you're going to go. You can always become legit and go down a straight path when you're 28. And for me, I had a decision relative to music. I'm going to give myself till I'm like 27, I think. And if I'm not actually in the black, I'm getting out. I'm not going to be that guy at 35, still trying to break into an industry that doesn't want him, that gets bitter. And that was the right decision. Having said that, yeah, like a lot of people said it was really stupid. Like, I didn't have a lot of people saying, oh, what a great idea. Most people thought I was out of my mind. But I mean, I remember getting to LA and seeing this guy from Champaign Urbana show the first browser, and that was Mark Andreessen. So he wasn't Mark Andreessen then, but like, I can still remember kind of being in that same little orbit then. And so you kind of have enough of those build up and you start to trust your instincts.
Where did you cultivate your risk tolerance? Was there a specific person or a mentor that shared what you're sharing with me right now? Because I do think it's a really, really interesting perspective. You were very successful and had worked at amazing companies, but you also took a lot of risks. Did someone help you through that? Did you have a mentor, or was it really your drive?
It's funny. I was talking to somebody about this exact thing last night. She asked me more or less the same question. And I think what happened was my father died completely out of the blue on New Year's Eve when I was 24, just dropped dead. And yeah, it's hard. But a friend of mine at the time from high school whose brother had died sent me this card that he wrote. And he essentially said something that is actually really dangerous, like when I look back on it, but it's a good thing to keep in mind. He said, when somebody close to you dies, take it upon yourself to live two lives and shoulder the burden for them as well, and you will be amazed how rewarding your life will be. I don't think I did that. That's not exactly what came out of my father dying, but I think I said, you know what? There's no guarantees on anything. Life's short. I can go down the road that's known, but that's no guarantee that I'm going to be happy or I'm going to live for a long time or anything. So since things were pretty, not dark, but I was pretty sad. Anyway, I thought, oh, the hell with it. Let's just roll the effing dice. Let's just see where we can get. It was kind of a dark place to be, having lost my father so young. And I think that probably influenced it a lot. And in reading other people's stories, I think that's kind of a common thing. People who lose somebody or have something traumatic happen when they're young, it just makes you more willing to gamble than you might be otherwise.
Thank you for sharing that. And obviously, I'm very sorry about your dad. And clearly, it's a lesson in cultivating resiliency. Your trajectory is so inspiring. Can you tell me what has been the highlight of your career so far? Is there a moment or a role or a company that has really felt pivotal that you feel extremely proud of?
There's like two moments. One was when I had my record label. I had discovered this rapper that I really liked, and we did a couple records. And I'd gone to a wedding in Boston, and on the way back, I stopped at Tower Records when that was still a thing. And all my records were in Tower Records in Boston. So in spite of the fact that it was hard doing what I was doing, I had done something that was really hard, which had gotten an independent label from nothing to being fully distributed domestically. And then I think I also had pretty good distribution throughout the UK and Northern Europe. So like, I remember that moment just feeling really satisfying. Like, okay, I don't know what's going to happen, but I did it. I won. Yay. And then the other was, I remember building the first or second week of NFL Sunday Ticket digital. NFL Sunday Ticket on DirecTV was big deal. It's still a big deal. DirecTV obviously doesn't have the package anymore, but so that's every Sunday game. That's a package that gives you every Sunday game of the NFL. So a huge number of games. And so I had built this thing. I was in the broadcast center. We finished the code. We pushed it out from my office and I drove home, and the thing was going to trickle through a kind of a backdoor channel in all the DirecTV boxes in the country, or all the DVRs that DirecTV had. I don't remember how many millions there were at the time, at midnight. So I remember driving home, and I lived like 10 minutes from there in Manhattan Beach, and going home and turning the TV on and watching as the guide repopulated. And there was like this cryptic code number, which was for me. And I went, okay, it worked. So this code is now going to like millions of households, and it's going to work in the morning. And then it became kind of a really widely covered story in the press over the next month. But I kind of knew that once it worked. So those two moments just kind of stick out for me as, okay, this was a lot of work. It was a lot of risk, but to the extent that I can win, I won. It worked. So yeah, those two jump out.
That's amazing. On the opposite side, if you had a time machine and you could go back and change one thing about your career, whether it's an investment or a person you really wanted to work for or a company you really wanted to work at, is there anything that comes to mind?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's not an economic thing. The one, if I had to pick one, was I had a record that I did myself with myself as an artist. And I was getting a lot of interest at one point. And I had a meeting with a guy, a manager who owned a studio and a label in Jersey. And I'd gone out to Jersey, and he was very flattering, but also very clear. If you're going to work with me, we're going to need to do this. You're going to take this song, you're going to put together with. And I was going through this whole thing, and I was like, yeah, but I want it to be more like Quadrophenia, which was an album that I really liked. And he said, yeah, but Quadrophenia didn't sell anything. Do you want to sell something, or do you want to be right? I wound up not listening to him, and I didn't do that deal. And that was a big mistake. I've always wondered if I went back and took his advice, what would have happened? It's fine, but yeah, that's the one that if I could turn back time and change something, that would be it.
I appreciate you sharing that. And one of the questions I wanted to ask you actually that relates to this a bit is taking feedback and people building a thicker skin and a strong approach to criticism. It's a bit what you're talking about, although a little bit different when you're getting creative feedback and you love something a certain way. But I am just curious about how you've cultivated resiliency in that department, especially since you mentioned you've pivoted a lot. You've gone into new industries, you've started companies, and I imagine that doing that comes with asking a lot of questions and criticism along the way. And you mentioned falling down a well and making mistakes. What advice do you have for people on receiving criticism and also picking themselves back up afterwards so that next time it doesn't hurt so much?
Yeah, another great question. To the extent that it's possible, don't take anything personal. It's not about you. Nobody really cares about you. They're thinking about themselves. So I mean, you see a lot of people, especially in places like Hollywood, they'll caucus with their friends or their agent or their manager. And actually at the Emmys, I used to just listen to the biggest stars on TV. I would just like walk around to hear the people who just won or who had lost talk to their agents and managers. And they would have this whole roadmap in their head, or if we had done that, or if we do this. And, 90% of it is actually nonsense because nobody really cares about you. They're doing their own thing. You're just kind of in the way. So there's a moment where if you're lucky, people might really look at your work and appreciate it. And that's an amazing, amazing feeling, but you can't control for that. So when people are responding to you or giving you criticism, they're really just talking from their own perspective. They're not doing it to hurt you. They're shadowboxing in their head with their impression of what it would be like to do what you're doing or whatever. They don't know what it's like to be in your shoes. So it's really important to get out of the way and listen. And in some cases you go, you know what? I'm never talking to that SOB again. They're toxic. They're nasty. They're just mean-spirited. They're manipulative. And that happens a lot of time. But in the moment, you don't overreact to it. And then, like I said, the guy whose name I wish I remembered gave me great advice. I wish I'd taken it, but for whatever reason, I just wasn't ready. So you do have to get out of your own way to the extent you can. It's super important. I think that's a big part of why it's so hard to be an A-list actor, writer, musician, celebrity, CEO, whatever, because people are going to say all sorts of the most horrible things possible about you just because it makes them feel better, because they're jealous. They feel bad about where they are. Tall poppy syndrome, if you know what that is, people like to pull each other. Tall poppy syndrome is when one flower grows up higher than all the others. A better example is the lobster thing, where if one lobster tries to crawl out of the pot, the others will sort of pull it down. It's not that people mean to be mean, but they absolutely do that. So you have to protect yourself. You have to be aware of it. But you also, when it's legit, you want to hear people giving you advice and try not to take it personally.
That really resonates with me because this is something I definitely want to work on, especially as I put more of my own thoughts into the world. I can feel self-conscious doing that. And it's a good reminder that people aren't looking at you that much, and to just do your own thing and chart your own path and take the criticism along the way from people that you respect, and the rest of it is kind of noise. You don't have to take the feedback from people who don't deliver it well. On the flip side, what is your approach to giving feedback? How do you think about giving it in a way that will resonate with people, that they'll receive it well, but still you are an investor, you're an advisor, you have to critique people, their company, their strategy, their work ethic, all of those things. How do you think about giving feedback?
Well, if you're an investor, that's a very specific thing. Let's put that to the side. I only give people advice if they ask for it. I don't give advice. It's just, there's no point. It's just, you might hurt somebody's feelings and you wind up going down a road where you have to explain what you mean, and it's torturous and it wastes a ton of my time, and I don't get any benefit from doing it. And most of the time they don't want to hear it anyway. So, and then ultimately, what do I know? Like, I don't know anything. Like, I don't know what Jane's talent is. I mean, I could guess, I could come up with an opinion, but it's just my opinion. I don't know. I don't have any special access to the truth. So I try to keep my mouth shut, to be honest. And if people ask if I'm close with them or if I care about them, then I'll try and give it to them. If I think they're doing something that's hurting themselves, then I'll say, why don't you give yourself a break and look at it this way? But rarely, I rarely give advice. If you're an investor, then you kind of have to. That's your job. And then that's a different agreement. They took your money, the money of your other LPs and so on. So they're going to listen to you. And that's what they signed up for. So if I think somebody is like doing stuff motivated by their own ego rather than the success of the company, which happens all the time, then you kind of have to say something because you owe it to everybody to make the most chance that this thing is going to succeed. You have to like try and help it succeed. And a lot of times new CEOs, new founders, they just get caught up. They raised a little bit of money and now everybody's telling them they're a genius and they start doing dumb stuff. So like in those cases, it's good to say, why don't you take a deep breath and go back and read what the priorities that we all agreed on are, because you're not living by them. You've changed, I don't know if you know this, but you've changed the priorities basically unilaterally, and that's not going to work for us. You're going to have a real problem if you don't stop it. And then you take it from there.
It sounds like you're very intentional with your time, which makes a lot of sense with all of the different things that you have done. To pivot the conversation a little bit, you and I have talked about this before, but I thought your take was very interesting since you're so immersed in the media and the tech landscape. Why do you think media companies are struggling right now? I want to hear your insights that are industry specific. Why do you think media companies are struggling, and what do you think they could do to turn their business model around?
So this is a favorite topic of mine, so I'm glad you asked. I did a speech a year ago where I showed a bunch of high-ranking studio people what the sort of trajectory for big tech versus Hollywood has been since the birth of Web 2, call it 2008. And essentially, between 2008 and 2023, the delta between the aggregate market caps of the 5 remaining studios and the 5 tech companies that buy stuff from Hollywood, so Alphabet, Apple, Amazon, Meta, and Google, if I didn't say them. But anyway, there are 5. The delta moved 11x out. In other words, those tech companies, their value grew 11 times more than Hollywood, which is a lot. And then coming back in this year, I knew it would be much worse. But when I actually ran the numbers, I discovered that the 5 studios aggregate market cap, so Wall Street value, and you can say what you want about Wall Street, but it's a pretty effective pricing mechanism. It's a hell of a lot more efficient than Hollywood's ever been. That the 5 studios market cap was less than 4% of the market cap of those other 5 companies. So like Lionsgate, for example, which is a really smart company, actually, generally, I remember they had been worth 7 billion, and then I turned around and they were worth 2. Paramount, everybody knows what happened there. I mean, it just kind of fell off a cliff, and now it'll be acquired. But like, I had clients whose aggregate market cap was like 3x of Paramount's, which was crazy. And it's because I'm pretty sure, because I was there, Hollywood made really bad decisions based on perverse incentives. They are almost all guys, or were, which is one of the problems maybe. They were managing to year-end bonuses and quarterly earnings calls. They weren't managing for the long-term health of the business. They didn't do stuff that would put their successors in the best possible situations. They did stuff that would make them look as good as possible when bonus time or contract re-up came. And that's what put Hollywood in this situation. They took short-term cash. So for example, when Microsoft invested in Facebook at the beginning, I don't remember the exact numbers, but you can look them up. I believe they invested and then they took 5% of Facebook at the time. Great investment, killer, really smart. Studios don't do that, right? They just say, okay, if you want this show, if you want Yellowstone or you want The Office or whatever it is, you're going to pay this much. And then they get a check and they go, yay. Well, no, that was real dumb, because now you help Netflix get billions and billions of dollars in aggregate market cap to compete with you by giving away your crown jewels. And so it's not that simple. It's more complex than that. And it certainly wouldn't have been easy to solve for, but that's the box that they put themselves in. And the last piece on that is it's really hard to overstate just how incredible the cash flow from the cable bundle was, unless you were there working on the specifics of those deals, which I was. So I didn't negotiate the deals between a Disney and a Comcast, but I was in there. I was involved. And the amount of money that big cable threw off for many years was just incredible. And everybody in Hollywood got addicted to it and never really faced up to the fact that it was going to go away. And it did go away because, we used to have 105 million paying TV households, and now we've got less than 50, and it's just going to continue to go down. All that was knowable. And so to round it out, that's sort of why in 2015, I started getting more involved in the financial markets, getting more involved in European business, because I could kind of feel that what I had been doing in Hollywood was going to become less lucrative and more frustrating over time, which was absolutely true.
So you mentioned media companies at the time thinking very short term. So as a solution, having more of a long-term vision, you also mentioned that they're less likely than tech companies to make those major investments like Microsoft and Facebook. Are there other lessons that you think media companies could take from technology companies, whether it's embracing the technology themselves or investing like you discussed? I'm just curious because you know both industries so well. And I have the reverse question too, which I'll ask you in a second, because I think those industries can learn from each other, but I'm curious what way.
The speech that I've been giving, basically, I present what I think was the major business model structure of Hollywood for the entirety of the 20th century. And I don't have time to go into it, but a lot of it had to do with constrained supply, because what was the elephant in the room was there were 7 record labels or 6 movie studios and however many publishing companies. As a creative, you didn't have a deal with one of those, you were outsy. Like, you were not going to get to a major audience. Everything was gate kept. If you didn't get a deal with Disney or News Corp or one of those guys, you were outside in the cold. Napster was the beginning of the end of that. Once there was peer-to-peer, people could upload and download whatever they want, and a lot of that stuff broke. That was kind of a crappy model to count on. Again, like going back to my cable bundle thing, the money was extraordinary, but nothing goes on forever. And people in Hollywood, when things are going well, they tend to say, oh, look how smart I was. And when things are going bad, they tend to think, oh, this is so unfair. Yeah, that's just really adolescent and not appropriate. Silicon Valley lives in a different mentality, which I kind of present as this cascade of tech super cycles where we've had this since the beginning. So vacuum tubes, transistors, the original mainframe computers to desktop computers to applications to OS to mobile to the App Store. There's successions of generations of tech, and they basically eat the ones that came before them. The ones that came before them they get destroyed. They get annihilated. Those people get driven out of business or they get acquired and it's over. There's no like peaceful old coexistence between the old way and the new way. You make as much money as you can in the old way while you can, knowing that you're going to get destroyed. You're going to get pulverized by whoever comes next. And so that's kind of why a big part of the reason that companies like Apple, Amazon, Alphabet are so good. They're so good at instilling cultures of innovation because it's Darwinian. If you start a division and it doesn't start throwing off money in a certain period of time, it gets shut down and those people are out. It's kind of cold in the way. I mean, it's not cold. It's Darwinian. I mean, it's like a jungle and you're going to eat or be eaten. So that's one thing that Hollywood has been really bad at. Another thing that is still shocking to me, and I never used to talk about this, but given where we are now, the amount of waste on a set is extraordinary. Like one actor is 2 hours late, so you have 85 people on the clock waiting around, and somehow that's considered okay. No other industry would consider that okay. But somehow, because these are creative industries, it gets passed through. And I'm not saying that creative businesses don't need certain affordances. They absolutely do. Like the writers' rooms discussions that were part of the strike. I absolutely believe that. Like the best television, which I'm a huge fan of what Vince Gilligan did, what David Chase did, Matt Weiner did, of the great TV stuff. The process those people had is nothing short of amazing. Every industry should study it. The writer's room of a great serial drama is one of the great processes that any industry could learn from. Pixar is another process that everybody could learn from. So there are these pockets that are like that. But I think Hollywood would do better to figure out ways to own the technology and then plug those kind of models directly into the tech rather than licensing out all of their stuff and effectively owning none of the tech.
You know, when I hear you talk, part of me feels like I'm back in school in like a great way, like back in business school, because everything you're saying is steeped in so much experience and insights. And it's really interesting and valuable to hear your perspective. I know that you were an adjunct professor at USC for a number of years. And to me, that indicates, one, that you have to know so much about an industry to be able to teach it, to feel comfortable speaking in front of students for so long. And two, that you want to help young people shape their careers and learn. Is there any advice that you wish you could have given your students that you weren't able to give?
That's a good question. No, I left it all in the field every year that I taught. I gave absolutely everything I could did. I didn't hold back anything, and it was great. To your point, the thing about that experience, especially at USC Cinema and Marshall, and I'm sure it's true at many other places, is that was the hardest audience I ever had. They would call bullshit on anyone really quickly. I would watch that group of kids and I would bring in friends who had started companies or entrepreneurs. And if that person was inauthentic or playing a game or pitching something crappy, you would see that entire class tune out, and they were not shy. They would just open their laptops, roll their eyes, fold their arms, and say, effectively, you're wasting my time. And when 60 people do that to you in a theater room at USC, it feels really bad. So they taught me as much as I taught them. I was always really interested to see what they were into and what they weren't into. So it was a great experience. There was no advice I could have given them that I didn't give them. Like one of them just reached out 3 days ago and said, "Hey, remember me? Can you write me a recommendation for this thing?" And I was like, "Yeah, of course." I remember you. I remember most of them. Advice for the ones I didn't teach. I mean, I guess it's everything I just said. I don't know that there's anything specific to students that isn't the same things that I said about everything else.
And since you've spent so much time with young people, what advice do you have for young people who are trying to figure out where to focus their time given the disruption that AI is having on the future of work? Whether that's someone who's coming out of high school and figuring out what to major in, what skills to build, what functions will be relevant. There's so many different categories of areas that are being disrupted. And even just experiencing business school, when it's almost cliche to talk about, but when ChatGPT came on the scene, like it really did change how the business school environment was operating, because Columbia
Absolutely.
really embraced it and we were allowed to use it for homework. We just had to say where we were using it. Every school is very different. I have friends in school now where it's completely forbidden, but then you have students looking on the job market and say they want to go into marketing, and they're thinking, well, if content is all going to be automated, where should I spend my time? If ChatGPT can code, where should I spend my time? So what advice do you have in that arena?
Well, that's exactly when you have to do all the things that, you don't have to do any of them. You can go to law school, you can go to medical school, you can go to become a CPA, become a CFA, become a CAIA. There's a lot of things you can do. But if you're going to go down like the road more or less that I went down, where there is no road, then that's where you start doing it. And you have to draw your own conclusions. So when I was in my 20s, I read everything, like every magazine, whatever industry was, all the trades, I read them all. Anybody that could be a mentor or that had been through it, if I could seek out their advice, I would do it. Now, I didn't always listen, unfortunately, like that story I just told you. But I would say that was kind of me being an artist, which is harder to be objective about. I mean, generally, I was pretty good as a business person, listening to people give me advice. In terms of AI specifically, I mean, I'm in the minority view here. Like I use ChatGPT. I'm a very active investor, so I listen to a lot of pretty detailed financial analyses of all the major chip companies and the major players, like from NVIDIA ecosystem, Cadence, Synopsys, Ansys, and then all the other, the Lam and AMD and all of the ARM, all the major NVIDIA competitors. But ultimately, it's not going to replace humans. It's going to do what sampling, the same people who hated hip hop because they're like, I'm a real musician. I spent 20 years learning how to play my instrument, and now this drum machine is taking my job away from me. It's like, yeah, no, it isn't. Like somebody who got really good programming a drum machine musically is taking your job away from you because they have a skill that you don't have. The machine didn't do anything. Machines don't do that kind of stuff. I don't think this is going to be any different from that. ChatGPT makes all sorts of mistakes. Like I put math problems into ChatGPT and they often give me a wrong answer. Like there's a bunch of questions I've asked ChatGPT where I'll say, I'm not allowed to disclose that information. Or you're asking, like, can you give me this email address of so-and-so, celebrity or somebody I need to get in touch with? And it just says I can't do that. So there's a lot of things that this stuff can't do. I wouldn't worry about it. I would try and figure out, again, where is there a niche? Like, that old Ikigai Venn diagram? I can't remember what it says.
I read that book.
Yeah, it's like what the world needs, what you're good at, what you can make money at doing. And the intersection of those three is where you want to go, which is a great way to look at it. So you got to find that. And AI isn't going to make that any harder, ultimately. There are jobs that are going to go away. There are new jobs that are going to come up. AI will enable all sorts of people doing certain things to do them a lot quicker, to have much higher output, much higher turnaround. The hardest thing, the most time-consuming thing I ever did was write my book. It took me 2 years. If I did it now, AI would be amazing. It would save me so much time. So, yeah.
It's a great lesson in constantly learning and absorbing as much as you can about the industries that you're interested in, which is why I want to have conversations like this. It's a great way for me to learn. And I also think it's a great way for other people to learn. As we kind of round out this conversation, which has been so interesting, and I've learned a lot, I'm sure other people have as well. What's next for you? What's motivating you in this phase of your career? And what goals or future projects are you most excited about?
So for me personally, and this isn't part of anything macro, blockchain runs in a very consistent bull cycle and then it crashes. So we're in the middle of a bull run. So right now, the main thing for me is I'm advising a specific group of companies. One fund that I work with, which is run by one of my best friends, we have sort of similar theses, but he's a great financial analyst and I'm pretty good at what's going to work from a consumer facing perspective. So we've got like 3 or 4 companies that that the fund is invested in, that I've invested in, that I'm advising, picking those, like taking my shots in this next bull run. That's a big part of it personally for me. And then I work with 2 top 15 companies in the space, in the blockchain space by market cap. So those are big things for me. On the question you didn't ask, which is sort of a combination of What interests me that I'm not doing that I would recommend people look at, I'm going to say something, and I've actually been writing on this on Facebook. I should probably put it somewhere else, but I can't figure out where it ought to live. And it's been a really interesting discussion. So an example that I think you want to learn from when you're starting out is the things that if you get out of your own mass hypnosis of what everybody is thinking and looking at, and you act like you just landed on Earth and you are completely unbiased, what would pop out to you? Look at those things. So I've written a couple pieces on the Beatles and Taylor Swift. And I used to do valuation work in media. And so I've been making this argument that I think the way people are looking at Taylor Swift as an economic and creative force has been pretty off for various reasons. But I mean, I'm a huge Beatle maniac. They were a big influence on me as a kid. But I think she's every bit as important, or will be, as they are. And that's a really unpopular view. People do not want to hear that from somebody like me who has a fair amount of gravity. But like, I kind of look at what she has done in inventing her own version of the media business without almost completely independent of all the traditional apparatus. So they wanted to do Eras as a movie. So she went to a studio, Universal, I'm pretty sure. And she said, we want to put this movie out when the tour is done. And they said, okay, great. It's going to be our big movie of summer 2025. And so she said, no, I want it to come out as soon as the tour is done because I want them to see it soon. So they said, oh, well, we don't work that way. So she went to AMC and they did it. And it was a staggering hit. That's an example of what's going to come after this media infrastructure that we're all still living through, because the opportunities for people to do things, if like your audience is a media and entertainment audience, there's going to be all sorts of opportunities to create direct to consumer engagements from a marketing perspective and from an economic perspective. I think blockchain, AI, and games environments are the three pillars of that. When I was a kid, again, you needed a major label deal to be a viable musician. You don't need any of that stuff now. And I'm really looking forward to the time where you don't really need it to do high quality television or whatever we're calling TV now too. Obviously, people have done that to some extent in the influencer community, but I think that stuff is all really interesting. There's an opportunity to create a completely new, more authentic, future facing economic model for entertainment. I think there are going to be really fascinating opportunities for people with stories to tell, with new businesses to build, to go direct to their audience and create much more efficient models that are much quicker to market, with more authentic products and more authentic experiences that don't require on the legacy infrastructure that we've all been dealing with. And so that's a huge personal area of interest to me. Like when I see people doing things like that, I find that really exciting and I want to help them. And I think if I were young, that would definitely be something I would look at.
That's very inspiring. And I am all about democratizing creativity and leading with authenticity, which you have certainly done today. Thank you so much for your time and your insights, for sharing your experience, which is huge. It's been awesome to have you on the show, and I've learned a lot, and I'm excited to share this with other people. So thank you so much.
Yeah, my pleasure. And if anybody wants to reach out and talk about anything, I'm really easy to find. So
awesome. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Jane.
I hope you enjoyed this week's episode of Your Career Unscripted. If something about this conversation inspired you, I'd love to know. Feel free to message me on LinkedIn at Jane Bernhard if there's a guest you'd want to hear from, or if there's a type of background you'd like to learn from, and I'll do my best to make it happen. If you enjoyed the content, please subscribe to my Substack and socials, follow Texas Immersive Institute, and check out TXI's Patreon at patreon.com/Texas Immersive for more thought leadership on the immersive field. And of course, please share the episodes with anyone who you think might find them helpful. See you next time.